Hey guys, I'm Chris Buck and a very warm welcome to Friday Fretworks, and this week we're taking a look at a guitar which I've actually done a video on already, but in light of last week's episode of Friday Fretworks, which just had a fair few number of views, it's generated a fresh round of interest. So what is it? Is it a real Gibson, or is it, whisper it, a fake Gibson? All I know is that it's an amazing guitar, and it is of course my Orville by Gibson ES335. And rewind to the late 1970s, and Gibson are in the throngs of what we now consider as their Norlin era. In 1969, Gibson's parent company CMI, Chicago Musical Instruments, were acquired by the Panama-based conglomerate ECL, who later that year would change their name to Norlin, a name which will make most guitar aficionados shudder. Not much would change initially, with Gibson remaining under CMI's control, but in 1974, Gibson would finally become a subsidiary of Norlin, and it's around this period things are perceived to have taken a marked downturn. Cost-cutting measures implemented by the new management led to a nosedive in quality, typified by the likes of Gibson's characteristic one-piece mahogany neck being replaced by a three-piece maple neck construction, and Gibson's typical one-piece mahogany back and maple top being replaced by multiple pieces of mahogany and multiple pieces of maple. It's also around this period that we see what are now thought of as pancake bodies. In essence, a thin piece of maple sandwiched between two pieces of mahogany, allowing for the use of thinner, cheaper, less desirable pieces of wood. Now, of course, it would be unfair to castigate all guitars made during this period as no good. The Les Paul Deluxe I played in a recent episode of Friday Fretworks was an incredible guitar, but ultimately, it's no doubt a period of Gibson's history that they would rather forget. But consequently, it's around this period that we start to see Gibson replicas emerging from the Far East. Around this time, Gibson's being notoriously hard to get hold of in Japan, primarily because of the unfavourable exchange rate. So in the early to mid-1970s, the Fujigen factory started manufacturing Greco Les Paul replicas, which, in hindsight, weren't particularly good. They weren't particularly historically accurate or of particularly high quality, but all of this would change in 1978 when Takai would get hold of not only an original set of Gibson blueprints, but crucially a 1959 Les Paul Standard, which they essentially cloned, leading to the birth of the Tokai Reborn series. This increase in detail consciousness led to Greco upping their game as well, with the introduction of the fantastic Super Real series, one of which I actually own, which for a number of years were considered to be the best Les Pauls made since that golden era in the 1950s. Needless to say, these guitars were a massive success, not only in their native Japan, but crucially as they started across the water and found their way into the hands of Western musicians, who ultimately were disillusioned with the quality of their American-made counterparts. Now, in response to this influx of increasingly high-end, well-made Japanese replicas, Fender and Gibson guitars, Fender would set up their massively successful Fender Japan division. I've made a video on that in the past, which I shall link to above, which of course gave birth to the massively collectible JV Fenders and Squires, which for many years to follow were considered among many to be the best guitars that Fender had made since their pre-CBS days. No doubt inspired by this success, Gibson would follow suit in 1988, when they essentially licensed the Fujigen factory to start making Japanese-made Gibson guitars, but thanks to the word Gibson already being trademarked in Japan, they were forced to turn to the first name of their founding father, Orville Gibson, giving birth to Orville by Gibson guitars. The birth of Orville guitars would see an immediate return to the specs and construction methods that players and dealers alike had been crying out for, with the high-end Orville by Gibson guitars in particular coming equipped with 500k pots, as opposed to the inherently darker sounding 300k pots that US-made Gibsons were receiving at this time. And of course the Les Pauls also coming with solid bodies, US-made counterparts of course being weight relieved using the Swiss cheese method at this particular point in time. Of course also came with the fabled long neck tenon, nitro finishes, fret edge binding, vintage correct neck profiles, and USA electronics and pickups. Now while the lower end or entry level Orville guitars, some of which were manufactured in Korea, would run from 1988 to 1998, the higher end Orville by Gibsons would cease production in 1995, making my 335 from that very same year a fairly late example. Though I bought mine for £1,400 shipped from France, about $1,700 at the time of writing, in May of 2020 in the midst of lockdown here in the UK. So it was a very long time until I really had a chance to put it through its paces in anything other than a YouTube video. But fast forward 3 years, I've had a chance to not only do a hell of a lot of filming and recording with this guitar, but also tour it fairly extensively. So I thought it definitely warranted an update video. First and foremost, my opinion on this particular guitar hasn't really changed since the first time I played it. It is a truly incredible guitar, and not with the usual caveats of for the money. Speaking of which, interesting to see how in the last 3 years alone, their stock has risen drastically, and you would really be hard pushed to find an Orville by Gibson for anywhere near approaching £1,400 these days. You're looking at closer to £2,000 now for, say, a 335, for example. I think for the longest time, they really were a little bit of a hidden gem that people really didn't fully appreciate or even know what they were before the information was so readily available, or idiots like me were making videos alerting people to how good these guitars actually are. Now in regards to specs, my particular 335 comes in at just under £8 actually, so definitely on the lighter side of life in regard to your typical 335s, which I particularly like. Came equipped with a Cluson set of tuners, an incredibly comfortable neck carve, of course then with fret edge binding, seems to mean a lot to certain people, that elusive long neck tenon as I mentioned, a pair of Gibson 57 classic pickups with 500k pots, nitro finish, and apparently US hardware. I say apparently as I haven't really been able to conclusively say or prove this either way, but it's worth mentioning that of the few upgrades, and really aren't many, that I've made to this guitar, changing the tailpiece to a Faber tailpiece was the first of which I did. That original tailpiece just felt not particularly high quality. It was heavy and a little clunky. Change that for a Faber, and I will probably do the same for the bridge at some point as well. The only other modifications that we've made, apart from changing the pots just for a more vintage accurate taper, the bare knuckle for anyone wondering at this point, was also to experiment with the pickups, who price melting some of that excess wax holding that 57 Classic together to very slightly loosen the structure, as well as offsetting the coils and experimenting with a few different grades of Alnico magnets, just in an attempt to get a little bit more top-end articulation and some of that typical PAF nasal quack out of the pickups. I might honestly change them at some point. They're still a little bit dark for my taste, but even with these few subtle modifications that I've made, I would honestly say that even with their kind of rise in stock, I guess, and their price increase in the last couple of years, they are still a steal. In regard to specs, I guess anything comparative from Gibson, the cheapest end of the 335 range would be the Satin range, which comes in at £2,700. But honestly, I feel like with the Orville by Gibson, you're getting definitely closer to custom shop territory, at which point, the nearest comparative for Gibson, you are looking upwards of £5,000. So is it a real Gibson? Now, I guess in the sense that it was produced in either Kalamazoo or more recently Nashville, probably not, but I honestly don't think Fender's import models suffer with the same stigma, and a large part of that I feel is down to the fact that it doesn't say Gibson, at least writ large, on the headstock. But it's important to remember that had the name Gibson already been trademarked out in Japan, these probably would have been labelled as such, with nothing really to set them apart from their US-made counterparts. But all of that aside, honestly, this is such an impressive guitar. I kind of feel duty bound to spread the word a little bit, even if it is at the expense of their cost rising. If you do see one of these in the wild, I implore you to check it out and not be put off by the name Orville on the headstock, which I guess for us Brits at the very least will always have slightly different connotations. As ever, I'm Chris Buck, this is Friday Fretworks. Thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe, hit the bell icon if you haven't already, and I shall see you next week for another episode. Cheers guys, take care, see you soon.